Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and the patch 11.05 brought with it a ton of new class changes, but it also kind of shifted the meta by quite a bit, with some of the classes that were underrepresented now doing far more damage than expected, and some of the classes we thought that were going to be doing really well, not doing nearly as well as we thought they might. Though as expected, after a brand new patch with a ton of new updates comes even more class tuning for the rest of the season, and looks like they're doing a bunch of new adjustments, mostly buffs, with some fairly sizable nerfs as well, where classes like warriors and warlocks, you heard me correctly, are receiving some tuning and some favorable adjustments, while the classes that we're seeing everywhere, the elemental shaman in particular, are receiving some nerfs, which was not expected, but by how much the nerf in them was a bit more surprising. It's a long one, so I am going to have some chapter marks down below in order to help you navigate the video a bit better, so you can skip around to all the sections that are most relevant to you. As always, if you want to see more regular updates for the War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe, but otherwise, let's dive right in. So when going over all of these new class changes, I want to do them in an alphabetical order, starting with the class of Death Knight. And what we've seen is Blood Death Knights being buffed up a little bit, with the class of spec rather having a lower representation compared to some of the other tanks. It does feel like it's gotten a little bit weaker ever since they did some early Deathbringer nerfs. So they're buffing Blood DK back up a little bit. Some of the basic abilities such as Blood Boil are seeing a 15% damage buff, Heart Strike a 20% damage buff, even the Blood Plague that spread from a variety of abilities, primarily Blood Boil, also seeing a 10% damage buff, and even your primary self-heal ability of Death Strike sees a 20% damage buff. So basic combat abilities, everything is being amped up all across the board. But also, Sen Lane is receiving a bit more love, which continues to be a very underrepresented playstyle that sees some play here and there, but Deathbringer seems to be just the most staple version of Blood DK, but Sen Lane is getting amped up with things like Vampiric Strike, proc chance being increased to 35% chance, up from 25%. The buff called Essence of the Blood Queen is also being increased in its duration to 25 seconds, as well as the Gift of Sunlayan will now increase the effectiveness of Blood Queen buff by 200%, up from 150% buff. So it should hopefully maybe make Sunlayan a little bit better. Hopefully Sunlayan will see some future play, but it's just been so far behind Deathbringer in almost all cases as a tank in hero spec. So it's going to be interesting if it'll actually see any more play going forward. Another class that's seen even more changes is the class of Druid, starting with the spec of Balance, and they actually have a developer known there where they say the goals of the boom kit changes specifically is to increase their single target damage, even out some of the power of the talents within the spec tree, provide a much better build flexibility as possible, make Power of the Golden a very effective single target option, and make talents like Touch of Cosmos and Halo Stars to be a little bit more competitive within their respective fields. So with that, we're seeing a Starfall buff from the get-go for Balanced Druids, a buff by 6%, as well as a Star Surge buff by 8%, though not applicable for PvP. The majority of these updates are global in PvE and PvP. The ability of Starfire sees a 5% damage buff, while Wrath sees a 10% damage buff. Both Shooting Stars as well as their respective Crashing Stars are seeing a 20% damage increase. And while some things are getting buffed up, Sunseeker Mushrooms are actually getting nerfed a little bit to grow 12% less often, I guess to make them a little bit more even with the unused version of Wild Mushrooms. The talent Touch of Cosmos has been buffed up and increasing the proc for Wrath to 15%, while Starfire proc has been increased to 22%. Power of Goldrin's damage is being amplified by 25% in PvE content, but this does not apply for PvP. The talent of Rattle the Stars has been further reduced from its PTR counterpart, only increasing the output of Starfall and Star Surge by 8% instead of 10%. They're also reducing the effectiveness of New Moon and Half Moon as of this newest update. For PvP, however, they are further increasing the survivability of Balanced Druids primarily through your own self-healing capabilities, such as Frenzied Regen heals now for 5% of your health per tick instead of for 3%, as well as the healing of Rejuvenation, as well as abilities like Wild Growth. Those healing abilities have been buffed up by 20% for PvP. As for the Healing Restoration Druids, they actually feel like some of their combat healing capabilities could be further improved. Call of the Elder Druid is supposed to encourage them to utilize some of the hybrid forms for some group-wide healing, or rather for additional damage whenever you don't need to heal groups. But what they're trying to do with Call of the Elder Druid is to increase its duration to 15 seconds so you can get the effectiveness of Heart of the Wild for a little bit of a longer window. This further compounds on top of Dream Scenarios buffs, which are coming out very soon, where they want to make Dream a little bit more of a good talent to pick up compared to the alternatives, or at least better than where it's currently at. So they're increasing the transfer rate of damage to healing. With Dream Scenarios being buffed up, now you'll transfer Wrath, 100% of your Wrath and 100% of your Shred damage to heal a nearby ally, and then 50% of your Starfire and Swipe damage to heal a nearby ally, which brings up the effectiveness of both of the single target and AoE healing, but also further gets impacted by Heart of the Wild, which further on top of it increases that healing transfer by 200% while Heart of the Wild is active, which will hopefully give Restoration Druids maybe potentially some hybrid healing capabilities. Feral Druids are not getting touched at all when it comes to raids and dungeons, but they are getting some reductions within PvP specifically, with your cooldowns such as Berserk as well as Incarnation increasing your damage by 10% in PvP, down from 15%, while the PvP talent King of the Jungle is also being further reduced, where the talent will now increase your healing received and movement speed by 3% per stack instead of 5%, but also the maximum stacks you can attain is 3 instead of 4. Next, we got a number of changes coming to the class of Hunter, primarily when it comes to the Dark Ranger, because there are some issues with the Dark Ranger where players are actually incentivized to use its AoE talent of Bleak Powder for single target, because if you have things such as Bestial Wrath, or basically rather, or Trick Shots as a marksmanship, you have Bleak Powder explode on the target when you hit him with a black arrow, but it apparently generates enough single target damage where you kind of want to try to maintain it, which creates for an awkward experience. So they're actually trying to reduce it a little bit, or at least reduce interaction, by making it so Bleak Powder no longer damages this primary target. This is meant to be an AoE talent to buff the effectiveness of marksmanship and beast mastery, but it's not really there to improve your single target damage. Outside of this, and don't shoot the messenger, but Blizzard themselves are saying the BM is apparently overperforming in single target, but has very lackluster AoE, and we can agree on the lackluster AoE in particular, so they got apparently fixes coming for both. When it comes to Pack Leader, they're apparently nerfing it a little bit by nerfing the damage of Vicious Hump by 10%, as well as the proc rate for Frenzied Tear by 10% as well. Even abilities such as Barb Shot are apparently taking a 25% damage decrease. Though when it comes to AoE content, they are buffing things such as Stomp by 50%, they're buffing the actual damage of the multi-shot ability by 100%, and with the talent of Explosive Venom, it'll now proc at 3 stacks rather than 5 stacks, and should now function a little bit more consistently within AoE content. When it comes to marksmanship, their note here is apparently Dark Ranger for marksman is a bit overperforming in single target, so they're looking to reduce it a little, but they're trying to compensate marksmanship with also more AoE buffs similar to Beast Mastery to keep the AoE performance roughly the same between the two hero specs. So for the spec of Dark Ranger, we're seeing things like Black Powder actually see a 10% damage reduction for marksmanship only, though Bleak Powder AoE damage has been increased by 25%, as well as a 25% buff towards Shadow Surge. And to make sure that Sentinel doesn't fall behind, they're also increasing Symphonic Arsenal damage by 15% on top of that. And both Beast Mastery and Marksmanship are seeing a bit of a downgrade when it comes to Dark Ranger within PvP content, like Dark Ranger Bleak Powder damage is being reduced by 30% specifically within PvP. The Capstone of Withering Fire will now fire black arrows at nearby targets at 25% effectiveness instead of 50% effectiveness within PvP combat. From there, we got some more buffs for the spec of Mistweaver. We're seeing a bunch of new things like a 6% overall healing increase. Kind of nice, we'll always take it. Awakened Jadefire will now cause your Spinning Crane Kick to transfer 110% of his damage instead of 90% of the damage into group healing, so that's even better AoE healing output based on the damage that you do, so that is also very, very nice to see. They're also buffing up the melee playstyle of Mistweaver, or rather the fist weaving playstyle, so Jadefire Teachings will now increase Ancient Teachings by an additional 160% instead of 140% to make that melee healing a little bit more competitive. On the flip side, if you play Rushing Wind Kick, they're also trying to buff that up a little bit by increasing his damage by 150%, and Rushing Wind Kicks will now increase your Renew and Mist healing by 100% for its duration. So there may be some opportunity to create a healing over time type of build where you can spread a bunch of Renew and Mist everywhere, go for a Rushing Wind Kick, and hopefully get resets on it to keep amplifying that healing of your healing over time effects. The talent of Yu'lon's Whisper, which I haven't played with in such a long while, apparently they're increasing its healing by 400% as of this newest build. So while channeling Mana Tea, you now exhale a breath of Yu'lon, which will heal 5 nearby allies. Maybe there could be some potential playstyle for it whenever you're sipping tea to be able to get random healing out of your character. However, as they're buffing some stuff up, they are going to be nerfing something, specifically Jade Bond when it comes to mastery of Chi G. Gust of Mist healing increase of 60% being reduced down to 50%. They also added a note where they said they wanted to reduce the power of this talent and place that healing throughout more of Monk's overall ability breakdown, while maintaining the cooldown reduction in the feel of the Chi G, while still maintaining the cooldown reduction that is possible with the Chi G mastery type healing. Besides all of the PvE changes, they're also changing up a mechanic when it comes to PvP, specifically to the Jade Empowerment playstyle, where casting Thunder Focus causes an next crack on the Jade Lightning to also do additional damage and cleave to nearby targets. They're reducing that cleave number from 4 targets down to 2 additional targets within PvP specifically. Another healer that's seen a few new changes is the Holy Paladin, specifically when it comes to PvP content, but we'll get to that in a second. They are doing some mana reductions for... What happened to my build? I set up a Herald of the Sun build earlier. Did I not save? Was it this build? Alright, very confusing. I thought I set up... Or not? Well, I guess it is a new update, so... bugs like this are to be expected. Either way, now that we got past that, they are doing some mana modifications for Holy Paladin within all forms of content. This includes PvE and PvP. Like Beacon of Virtue now costs 5% of mana instead of 4%. I guess that's gonna affect the mana a little bit. Then also Holy Shock mana cost has been increased from 2.6% of your mana to 2.8, which is kind of, I guess. It is a bit of a mana increase, so I guess mana economy is going to be a little bit tighter, but hard to really say if this is going to be too detrimental. Where we are seeing a number of changes for Holy Paladins, however, is majority in PvP. So we have a bunch of different things that are being adjusted specifically within Herald of the Sun, but also within some baseline changes. Like Herald of the Sun, a Blessing of Anshi talent is being adjusted, where instead of increasing the effectiveness of an next Holy Shot by 200%, that is now being downgraded to 150%. The actual healing of the Eternal Flame ability is also being lowered by 10%, but same goes for the actual Word of Glory ability. So whether you play Herald or whether you play Lightsmith, Word of Glory or Eternal Flame are both being reduced by 10%. The mana regeneration of Paladins within PvP content is taking an additional hit on top of this Holy Shock Beacon of Virtue change, where your mana regen is now going to be decreased to 25% in PvP, which was initially 20% previously. Blessing of Summer that allows you to place a buff on an ally and cause them to transfer a portion of the damage they do to heal allies. This transfer debuff is now being reduced within PvP content, now transfers 12% of all healing into damage within PvP, was initially 18% of all healing will be transferred into damage. Though numerically you are getting some buffs, especially when it comes to damage output as Holy. So things like Hammer Wrath are seeing a 30% damage buff, Judgment seeing a 30% damage buff, Crusader Strike is also seeing a 30% damage buff, which you would think would work really well with Avenging Crusader, but they're also further reducing Avenging Crusader from 260% transfer rate down to 200% transfer rate. So I guess if you're looking to do more melee damage, or Avenging Crusader damage is really going to be normalized to these changes. But where this does help is if you play a more healing build with Avenging Wrath, you will still retain a lot of that baseline damage, whether you play a more damage to heal playstyle or heal to damage. So I guess it opens up a couple of new options. So if you were playing a very melee heavy build with Avenging Crusader, you now can maybe take a bit of a back step and play more of a caster heavy build instead, potentially. From there, we have a number of changes coming to another healer, which is disc-based. A little bit of Holy, a little bit of Shadow changes here as well, but mostly to the class of Prey, starting with disc. And disc-based right now are a little bit too reliant on Atonement to heal their allies. Where normally other healers just press the healing buttons to make their allies' health go up, disc-based have to place a buff on their ally, then damage something, and the harder they hit that something, the more healing that does to your allies that have that Atonement buff. But as soon as, and this is a big problem in dungeons, as soon as they lose a target that they can reliably DPS, like let's say it dies a little too early and the rest of your group is just dotted with a heavy bleed, disc-based have a hard time really just focus healing everybody else around you. So they have a very unique playstyle that's very, very strong, but as soon as you don't have a target to hit, that kind of goes out of the window. So they're trying to help Disc Priest in that department specifically. So things like Power Word Radiance, which does a bit of instant healing to your allies, that's being buffed up by 20%. Your Flash Heal, your very, very basic Flash Heal, also getting buffed up by 15% on top of it. On top of it, they're trying to make the Oracle playstyle for Disc Priest a little bit better, more universally, not just in very key dungeon scenarios. So things like Premonition of Piety, one of the buffs that you can have, that healing is being increased by 20% up from 15% within PvE content. As well as talents like Preemptive Care will now increase the duration of your atonements by 4 seconds instead of 3 seconds, which is a nice buff within raid content. Shadow Priests are seeing another buff, specifically when it comes to their AoE damage, with Psychic Link further improved. They recently nerfed it for, I believe it was the PTR build for Shadow Priests, where they didn't really do too many changes. They kind of just toned down the damage of Psychic Link. They're now bringing it back up, so instead of cleaving all targets with Vampiric Touch for 25% of your direct damage, instead it's going to be 30% of your direct damage. So a nice little buff for Shadow Priest overall. From this point on, however, we'll talk about some of the Priest PvP specific changes, starting with specs like Disc, then Holy, and then Shadow. For Disc, they wanted to balance out the two hero specs a little bit better, because there's a lot of Oracles, but not as many Void Weavers, and they're trying to make Void Weaver just a little bit better. Specifically, Void Weaver's Void Heart talent is going to be improved within PvP combat, where Void Heart will increase your atonement healing by 30% up from 20%. Oracle, on the other hand, is a very popular pick, especially the buff of Premonition of Solace, which is kind of like another external, like a mix of like a big power word shield, but also pain suppression at the same time. They're nerfing the Premonition of Solace by a little bit, reducing its damage taken reduction by down to 10% instead of a 50% DR, as well as the absorption effect, they're reducing that by 15% on top of that. For the spec of Holy Priest within PvP combat, they're just buffing some of your key abilities, like Renew, buffing it up by 20%, while buffing Prayer of Mending by 10%. For Shadow Priest, they're doing some weird things when it comes to the Void Weaver talents for PvP. Specifically when it comes to the Void Leech talent. They're changing the rate of this ability to heal instead of... They're changing the rate at which this ability heals, healing every 3 seconds instead of 2 seconds, but the healing is increased to 4% rather than 3%. But apparently Void Leech healing is now reduced down to 2% while you're actively in combat within PvP. So I guess it's better healing when you can get out of combat, but worse healing while you're mid-combat, so I guess to account for its overall transfer rates. And on top of it, they're also nerfing the damage of Collapse and Void by 10% within PvP. And with how popular Void Weaver is, I guess you could say it was a little bit expected. From there on, we have the spec of Assassination Rogue, where we're seeing the slightest of adjustments, specifically to the talent of Master Assassin, which increases your critical strike chance by 25%, which can have a 12-second window depending on how you build your character. They're reducing that critical strike chance from 25% down to 20%. Not the biggest of nerfs, but I guess it does slightly make the whole Subterfuge playstyle a little bit less good to some degree. Now the next class I've seen a number of changes is the class of Shaman, and while I was just hanging on my Shaman, is this new? Can somebody in the comments let me know? Whenever you pop in and out of Ghost Roll, if you now have this like wind animation around your character, that gotta be new, right? There's no way I missed this thing. Anyway, if you're a Shaman player, I'm gonna ask you to sit down, because this set of changes is, yeah, it is something. I mean, everybody to play the Shaman knew that some kind of a tuning pass was going to come in, and players expected to see a little bit of nerf, but this seems like a lot of changes all at once. First, some good news. Farseer is getting a handful of buffs, specifically with its Ancestors. Ancestors Chain Lightning is being increased by 40%, not applicable for PvP. Ancestors Lava Burst ability up by 15%, also not applicable in PvP. And Ancestors Elemental Blast ability also increased by 15%, but not in PvP. Though Stormbringer does see some nerfs, like Arc Discharge, which instead of having Tempest grant you 2 uses of Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt instacast, it is now going to be downgraded just to 1 ability. The talent of Voltaic Surge that buffs the damage of Earthquake and Chain Lightning by 50% is being reduced down to a 5% damage buff instead. The talent of Echo Chamber that increases the damage dealt by your elemental overloads is being downgraded from 40% down to 20%. On top of it, Ascendant's ability is going to increase the damage of your overloads by 100%, down from 120%. Oh, but it just continues on as Preeminence, instead of granting you a 25% haste buff, it'll now be down to 20%. So if you did want to see a light at the end of the tunnel, I guess Ice Fury does increase your frost shock damage by 200% instead of 150%, so I guess that's a buff. Though we do have some PvP specific changes for Shamans as well. Further nerfs for the most part, like Ascendance, instead of buffing itself within PvP by 75%, that has been downgraded to overload damage increase by 25%, down from 75. Though the damage of your lightning bolts in PvP is being increased by 10%, which I guess is kind of nice, although there's just not a lot of time for you to hard cast a lightning bolt in most cases, but I guess it's going to synergize pretty well with the Stormkeeper procs. Though we also do see some additional changes for the spec like Enhancement Shaman, like Lightning Bolt damage for them, especially as a Stormbringer playstyle. Lightning Bolt sees a 10% damage reduction, though a reduction that does not apply for PvP combat. Chain Lightning also sees a 10% damage reduction, also not applicable for PvP, and the damage of their Tempest ability is being further reduced by 15%. But also, it only works for PvE reduction, but in PvP, the damage stays the same. Where Enhancement does see a change is in the totemic playstyle, specifically the capstone when it comes to PvP combat. Whirling Earth element that increases your Flame Shock's direct damage by 300% is now being downgraded in PvP combat down to 150%. This is probably because it combined really well with Voltaic Blaze, which greatly buffed the damage of your Flame Shock ability, turning it into a Voltaic Blaze, which would stack together with Totemic and compound together for a very, very powerful burst combo. As for Restoration Shaman, we're mostly just seeing buffs all across the board, specifically towards the Farseer playstyle, which isn't as popular as Totemic, like Call of the Ancestors Chain Lightning damage is being amped by 40%, not in PvP, but only in PvE, but also the Ancestral Lava Burst damage being amplified by 15%, also not applicable for PvP. What is, however, applicable for PvP is some baseline healing for Restoration, with things such as Healing Wave as well as Healing Surge buffed up by 15% within PvP combat, which should hopefully make the overall throughput a little bit better. Though it seems like whoever is the dev that ended up gutting out Shamans apparently plays Warlocks and Warriors, because out of all the classes, those are the two that are receiving the biggest numbers of buffs as of 11.05 update. Just to make sure we go in alphabetical order, let's start with the spec of Affliction, which is receiving a number of tuning updates. Things like Wither is getting buffed up by 25%, not in PvP however. Actually, I guess I should say it right here, all of the Affliction Warlock changes do not impact them for PvP combat, only within dungeons and raids, like the Wither 25% damage buff. Agony is also being increased by 15% on top of that. Base Corruption, if you don't pick up Hellcaller, is also being increased by 25% as well. And also Unstable Affliction damage is being amplified by 20%, which increases the overall single target, but also some of their AoE components. Though out of all the three specs of Warlocks, it seems like Demonology is the one that's getting the most amount of special attention this time around, with things such as the Dreadstalkers. Whenever you summon them, when they disappear, normally there's only a 50% chance for them to spawn a demonic core, so you're able to cast demon bolts at your targets. They're now increasing it back up to 100% chance to generate demonic core procs, which would hopefully help them out with their damage, but also resource generation. Also, Call Dreadstalkers on their own will do 10%, actually 20% more damage instead, so that's quite a significant increase in single target but also AoE, since those Dread Puppies can also cleave. The Grimoire to call Felguard has also been amplified and now increases its damage by 125%, up from 60. And also simple abilities such as Hand of Gul'dan do 25% additional damage as of this newest update. From there we have Destruction Warlock, where some of their damage changes are global for PvE and PvP, while others aren't. So starting with things like Hellcaller, the Wither damage is being amplified by 25%, not in PvP however. The damage of Chaos Bolt is further being improved by 10% globally. Damage of Immolate is also being improved by 25% globally. Incinerate by 20%. Conflagrate by 25%, though not in PvP, as well as Rain of Fire improved by 20%. So they're just getting buffed up all across the board, no matter which type of Diabolist or Hellcaller Destruction Warlock that you play. From there, we have the class of Warrior, which is the last class to receive some brand new buffs, starting with all warriors receiving additional buffs towards the ability of Execute, increasing it globally for all three specs by 10%. From there on, we got some spec-specific changes, starting with arms demolish ability, which is receiving 15% more single target damage, which is kind of interesting. As for arms as Slayer, we have the ability Reap of Storm, which is receiving a 25% damage buff, though not within PvP. Though the ability of Slayer Strike also sees a 15% damage increase. Outside of this, all of the basic combat abilities for arms from Mortal Strike, as well as Overpower, and even the Dreadnought damage are all being increased by 15%, as well as the damage increase to Cleave, further amplified by 20%. For PvP combat in particular, Slayer's ability of calling Cyclone is being actually buffed back up, where each strike of Blaze Storm will now deal additional 20% damage, evenly split amongst targets, instead of 10% originally. Also, basic abilities like Slam are seeing a 40% damage buff within PvP combat, and the primary ability of Colossus Smash is seen as 60% damage buff within PvP specifically. From there, we have the spec of Fury Warrior, which has seen very similar changes to arms in terms of their Slayer playstyle, with things like Reap the Storm increased by 25%, though not in PvP, with Slayer Strike buffed up by 15% as well. The Mounted Thane Fury also got a nice buff as well, with Lightning Strike's passive damage increased further by 30%. On top of it, basic abilities like Bloodthirst got a 30 or 20% damage buff, as well as the Bloodbath variant got a 20% damage buff as well, with the ability of Rampage also further increased by 10% on top of that. And just like for Arms Warrior within PvP combat, Culling Cyclone gets buffed back up within PvP specifically, with its stacks or damage increased by 20% per stack instead of 10. And finally, we have Protection Warrior, where we only see one specific change for them, which is the Colossus Demolish ability, single target damage buffed by 15%, similar to match the Arms Warrior playstyle. But with that, that's going to be our long new update for the patch 11.05 in the War Within, featuring a bunch of buffs and a bunch of nerfs. And wouldn't be surprised if even more tuning was announced by the time Monday rolls around or sometime by then. But as always, I did want to thank you guys so much for checking out this update, and I hope you guys did enjoy it. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community if you want to keep up with all the regular updates for the War Within expansion. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.